And we're gonna put this up nice and clear at the front. This is a snarky video. I'm coming here to talk to you about the books that I hated this year. And so obviously, big disclaimer over the entire video. This is just my opinion. So grab yourself a cup of tea, make sure it is piping hot, and let's dive right in. I do feel like this year, while I do have plenty of books to tell you about that I didn't like, obviously, equally I don't feel as angry at as many of the books that I read this year. This year, while we do have the books that I just think are bad, or a bit offensive, whatever, we also just have some kind of like, books. And that is where we're gonna start with number 10 on my list, and yes, I ranked them, which is kind of 2 books, but for me it was a bind up, so I'm counting it as 1. And that was the first 2 books of the Sherlock Holmes series. I don't even remember what they were called. A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of 4. And I actually didn't mind A Study in Scarlet, the first book. I mean, it is kind of weird with it being kind of 2 separate books, even within that one book, and the second half being set in like Iowa or something. It was so weird, but I kind of almost appreciated that strangeness. It was the second book though, The Sign of 4, that I really didn't like. I didn't find it as interesting. I didn't find Sherlock as charming. Not that charming's not the right word for how I found him, but you know what I mean. I think by that point it just felt more arrogant than anything, which I get is kind of the point, but like it also just has not aged well, which I don't know what I was expecting, but yeah, there's some slurs. It's a bit racist, and I didn't find the story interesting enough to kind of try and put my historical reading lens on and appreciate it for what it was. I just didn't like it. I do have the whole series though, and I have heard the short stories are better, so I'm gonna try a little bit more just out of curiosity. But so far, I am not really loving Sherlock, and particularly The Sign of 4 has made my worst of 2023 list. Now, on to number 9. And this is where I tell you that I have included books that I DNF'd. I'm gonna make it clear that I DNF'd these books, and obviously take my reviews with a pinch of salt. But this year I was more intentional in DNFing when I didn't want to keep reading a book, which does mean that I finished fewer bad books this year. That's great. Yay for me. However, obviously I still did read at least parts of these books, and so when I think about my reading experience of 2023, some of the books that come to mind as my worst reading experiences are the ones that I DNF'd. So my 9th worst book of the year is Witch King by Martha Wells. Now I actually did do a full dedicated reading vlog for this, which obviously is a little disappointing in the fact that it ends in a DNF, but I just could not bring myself to keep going with this one. I did get a fair way through. I want to say I got close to halfway. And if you were to ask me if this is a terrible book, I don't know, like that's not how I would describe it. Instead, I think this would fall into the category of just extremely disappointing to me. And primarily that is because I love Murderbot. Murderbot is one of my favorite characters. That is another book series by Martha Wells. I haven't finished the series, but when I think of characters in literature that just feel so embodied and that I just love with my entire being, Murderbot would be top of that list. And so while I was a little bit apprehensive going into a much larger book by Martha Wells, and obviously it's fantasy rather than sci-fi, I figured that at the very least, I would have a good time getting to know these characters, because she proved in Murderbot that she can do character work supremely well. Alas, these characters were so boring and uninspired. And the thing that just boggles my mind is the fact that like our main character, he is the Witch King. He's like this demon guy. He has all these amazing powers. Like he's so incredible. And yet, as a character to read, he is dull. As for the story itself, it did feel quite complicated to begin with, but the further on I got, the more I realized I was confusing complicated for just, it was convoluted. At least for me anyway. I think if I liked the characters, I wouldn't mind spending that time with them, but the characters were dull and boring as hell. So I just needed to get off that ride, and I DNF'd it. The next book is another one that I DNF'd, and I DNF'd this one pretty early, I'm gonna be honest, and it's Big Swiss. I feel like this book is going to be on a lot of people's end of year favorites. Obviously, I can't agree. This is Unhinged / sad girl lit fic. And to be fair, I do not have a great history with this category of book. I've only read a handful of them and none of them have worked for me so far. So while I usually like to try and say that like I understand why other people would like it, I kind of don't, because I just don't get this kind of book, to be perfectly honest with you. But this one in particular, I just found kind of icky. To begin with, it's kind of racist. But secondly, it was the way that mental health was being framed and used in this story that I found off-putting. Obviously, I didn't finish this book, so again, grain of salt. But as a disabled person with a lived experience of severe and complex mental illness, I just found this really kind of offensive, personally. I think it's the way that this book and books like it tend to take the very outward expressions and presentations of mental ill health and kind of turn them into this kind of like wacky, weird, unhinged spectacle. And a lot of the times they use mental illness in order to comment on the ways in which women experience society or experience sexuality, stuff like that. But at least to me, there's just something a bit icky about using mental health as a bit of like a metaphor or a sandbox to explore sexuality. How it read to me was that it was kind of highlighting how strange and weird and unhinged these characters were. And that itself is part of the entertainment. It's almost like it's this weird postmodern take on romanticization of mental illness. It's like post-romanticism. And I kind of hate it. I just hate it. Okay, but moving on. Next up, we have The League of Gentlewomen Witches. This is an historical fantasy romance, and it's another book that I DNF'd. Honestly, some of the books that I DNF'd, I do feel pretty strongly about how much I hate them. But because I DNF'd them, I feel like they belong, you know, at the back end of this list, which is why most of them, not all, but most of them are up here at the front. So this is the second book in a historical fantasy romance series. The first one was nothing especially amazing, but it was a fun, rompy time. This second one I was immediately enjoying less. Like, it just didn't have as much charm. I didn't like the characters as much immediately off the bat. But there was one particular moment that literally just made me want to throw the book across the room. And again, it has to do with mental illness. This is clearly something that is close to my heart, that I care about, and when I see it poorly represented in books, or at least in ways that upset or offend me, it tends to be a hard no. In this one, we had our heroine of the romance. She was a witch and she was trying to steal something from a museum. And so she's talking to the curator of the museum, trying to convince him that she is a doctor, and so therefore she can access this secret area of the museum so that she can steal this object. And then our hero, the love interest, he's kind of like her rival. He's also out trying to steal stuff. He interjects himself into this conversation and tries to undermine her so that he can get to the object first. And he does this by telling the curator that she's actually crazy and unhinged, and that they're actually married, and that she's obviously just very confused. He's actually the doctor. She's just some crazy woman who's forgotten her meds today. Isn't that sad? And it was all written in a way that is supposed to be funny. That was supposed to be a funny conversation. Like trying to weaponize mental illness discrimination and sexism and the icky kind of intersection there to undermine somebody in that way. And then obviously he's the love interest. So later I'm supposed to turn around and root for him? Like absolutely not. There was no way. There was nothing he could have done that would make me invested in a romance between the two. So it was a hard no from me. I DNF'd that and I'm never touching that series ever again. Next up, we have a book that I have actually finished, although I did soft DNF it earlier in the year and then I returned to it, which is obviously something I shouldn't have done. And that is Song of Silver, Flame Like Night. This is a young adult fantasy with like a heavy romantic element. And at least for me, I found it relied hugely on tropes and info dumping. Oh my God, the info dumping in this book. To be honest, it started out pretty promising. I liked kind of like the first section of the book when we were getting to know the female main character. But once she kind of moved on from her initial like situation, and then she met somebody who would become the love interest, I think his name was Zen. He also got his own point of view chapters, and I swear to God, those chapters served solely to provide info dumps to us as the reader. Basically, his job was to be a romantic interest and to tell her everything about the world that she didn't already know. And obviously, by extension, tell us too. So every other chapter was basically a lecture from Zen, and oh my God, did I find it dull. And I honestly had high hopes going into this one. So not only was it hugely disappointing, it was also just a really frustrating reading experience. Okay, next up is a book that I honestly don't feel that strongly about. I just think it's kind of a little bit shit. And that is The Golden Spoon. This is supposedly a cozy mystery book. It's kind of like loosely based on the Great British Bake Off. It's set in America. It's a baking competition show. And as a Bake Off fan, oh my God, did this premise sell me immediately. This had so much potential and all of it was completely washed down the drain. It was just aggressively mediocre. The murder, like it's hinted at in the kind of like the prelude, but it doesn't happen until right at the end. There's hardly any intrigue for almost the entire book, and there were so many opportunities for it. This could have been so much more interesting, so much more playful, so much more camp, and instead it was just dull. The writing was bad, the framing was bad, it felt like a draft that managed to get sold and published because of that premise, because people like me would be complete suckers and pick it up regardless. So I guess they were right, it worked. But at what cost? Okay, so that's number 5. Now we're heading into my top 4. And all of these I feel quite strongly about. I hate these books and I feel comfortable saying that. Number 4 is The Keeper of Enchanted Rooms. This is a cozy historical fantasy romance. And I read this in my historical fantasy reading blog, so link below in the description box. And I do talk about this book quite a bit, kind of breaking down all of the reasons I hated it, but I did manage to finish it. So the one redeeming factor is the fact that it's a very quick and easy read. But it's on this list because I hated pretty much everything else about it. As I said, it's supposed to be this kind of cozy historical fantasy romance. It's set in America, I don't know, like 100, 200 years ago. And basically it's our world, but with a little bit of magic, and sometimes houses can be magic too. And while some of the aspects of the magic system are interesting, the root of it is kind of really icky. Basically, it's a kind of magic that is hereditary, which is fine. There's plenty of books where magic is hereditary, I know. But the framing of this one in particular, I just found kind of gross. To begin with, the way that the magic is spoken about is as if only Europeans have magic, and it's explained by telling us that the magics come from or are like inherited through Jesus's disciples, which like right off the bat, Jesus wasn't white. I don't know how many times we have to say it, and he certainly was not European. But anyway, because magic is inherited directly through bloodlines, there's just an awful lot of discussion of bloodlines, and there's literally breeding systems in this world designed to not only keep magic going, but to kind of create like the right kinds of magic and the right levels. Like the magic literally has like scores for how magical each person is in each different category, and you can like selectively breed to get like a particular kind of magic in your child. On top of that, it being set in America a couple hundred years ago following European characters or characters from European descent, it doesn't reference or talk about Indigenous people whatsoever, except once where the villain of the story describes America as a purged slate. Ew, 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 ew. So in a book where the magic system is literally like some kind of icky eugenic system, we also just have like a casual reference to Indigenous genocide. Great, absolutely. So that was like my big kind of like moral issue with the story. Other than that, the characters were just utterly dull. And also the characters, as well as this whole story, just gives off a very prudish, chaste kind of vibe, which that combined with the fact that, you know, we have references to this magic system being created by Jesus, it just, did I accidentally read religious propaganda? I don't know what this was. Regardless, I hated it. Okay, now book number 3 is another book that I did actually DNF. I DNF'd this book at page 75. So I know some people will take issue with a book that I DNF'd being on this list at all, but certainly being this high. Number 3, but it is a non-fiction book. In fact, it's the only non-fiction book on this entire list. And it is called Spectrum Women. It's a non-fiction book about the experience of autism, particularly in women. It framed itself as being this really diverse, incredible, revolutionary perspective, which I do understand that women, girls, non-binary, trans people have largely been excluded from the conversation around autism and our experiences. But the way that this book really framed itself is this massive achievement in diversity. And yet, most of the women's voices who are represented here that I looked up are white. All of them are low support needs. Many actually identify as Asperger's rather than autistic. And some of them are very clear about preferring this distinction. Many of the women have very high paying corporate jobs, and most of them, up until the 75-page mark where I DNF'd, made some reference to autism not being a disability. Obviously, all of this makes for a very limited set of experiences in what is declaring itself to be a really diverse and representative anthology. There was a chapter on gender and diversity, and I was really looking forward to this one, hoping that we would finally get an introduction of some trans, non-binary, or queer rep. But nope, instead we got a woman who fit most of those categories I mentioned earlier. basically talking about how she was a bit of a tomboy. On top of that, throughout other chapters, there were several references of gender being a binary, which is always icky, but especially in an anthology that is professing to be diverse about autism, a community with huge queer rep. Totally disgusting in my view. Another of my issues with this anthology was just its framing. Basically, each chapter includes like a kind of own voices essay by an autistic woman talking about a different subject or topic. And then at the end of each of those essays by an autistic person, there is like a little discussion by a psychiatrist who basically kind of chimes in as this expert, and almost every single time this happened, they were really emphasizing assimilation, as if assimilation is the ultimate goal for all autistic people, which obviously, icky, super icky. But finally, the nail in the coffin for me was in the chapter on personal relationships, and you guessed it, it was on page 75, the very page I DNF'd at. I'm going to read you the quote that literally made me slam the book shut and say absolutely the fuck not. For individuals on the autism spectrum to entertain the idea of getting married, you must be realistic and be sure each person has quite a good level of independent functioning. Both should have a job. The way that a diverse book about the experience of autism is being so explicitly ableist? What the fuck? Obviously, the implication there that autistic people with higher support needs aren't deserving or allowed to have romantic relationships, and certainly not marriage, or someone who does not or cannot work for any massive range of reasons shouldn't entertain the idea of marriage. I was honestly gobsmacked. Not that somebody would think this, because I know that this is a pretty common ableist as hell belief. And internalized ableism is insidious. But the fact that it made it into a published book that has really good reviews on GoodReads, disgusting. Absolutely disgusting in my view. And this is only my third worst book of the year because I DNF'd it so early. I think if I had have continued and I had have finished, I would have put it up higher. So yeah, that's my number 3 worst book of the year. What's number 2? Number 2 is Priy of the Orange Tree. This book is absolute crap in my view, but it's not hateful and like offensive in the same way that Spectrum Women is, obviously. I still feel very strongly about my passionate hatred of this book, primarily because it's 1,000 pages long. I read 1,000 pages only for it to end up as my second least favorite book of the year. This is a book that I did a full spoiler-filled reading blog of. That'll be in the description box below for you. This is an epic fantasy that is just one of the most derivative things I've ever read. It's basically a tale of good versus evil, and it tricks you into thinking that it's complex or interesting or that it has layers and substance by being convoluted as hell. The characterization is some of the flattest I have read all year. There is no substance to the characters, to the themes, to the plot, to any of it. We spend 700 or 800 pages building up to this like epic conflict with the antagonist of the story, for all of it to be literally done and dusted within the span of like 20 or 30 pages. It was just ridiculous. For all of the build up to how like difficult and insurmountable and impossible this conflict was going to be, it was resolved almost instantaneously. It was resolved so easily that it was comical, which means there was just absolutely no payoff. This is definitely one of the least satisfying reading experiences I've ever had. Okay, and then finally, my least favorite book of the year is actually one I don't think I have spoken about on the channel before, and it's just an itty bitty novella that I literally read a week or two ago, and it's by an author who I was on the verge of considering a new favorite of mine. It's by Banana Yoshimoto. It is her new release of the year, or in fact, it's an older book of hers, but it has just been translated to English, and it's called The Premonition. And it is just a piece of garbage. Don't mince your words or anything, Katie. It's a very short book, and honestly, I had high hopes. I have read 3 of Banana Yoshimoto's books, and I have given all of them 4 or 5 stars. I loved them. And in fact, in 2022, Amrita was my favorite book of the year. The Premonition had so much potential to be a really interesting, introspective, bittersweet, atmospheric exploration on family and memory, and also with like a bit of grief and love sprinkled in, which are themes that she seems to return to time and time again. And in previous works that I've read from her, she's handled really well. And so that's what we're building for the first half of the book. But then at about the 50% mark, we just throw all that out the window, and we instead get a not technically incest romance between two people who thought they were siblings but then just found out that they aren't. They've literally spent their entire lives thinking they're brother and sister, and then when they find out that they're not, they get it on. And it's framed as totally normal and kind of romantic, and then immediately after, we then get a student-teacher romance that again is framed as normal and romantic. One of those would have been enough for me to kind of hate this book and probably put it on this list. But to get both in one 100-page book back to back, are you fucking kidding me? Honestly, part of me feels like I made it up. I genuinely feel like I kind of just hallucinated that book, especially after how much I loved her other three. To then dive into something like the Premonition and get those two relationships justified to me. I'm honestly kind of shell-shocked. I still have a couple of her other books on my shelf that I've been meaning to get to because, like I said, I thought she was going to be a new favorite author. And I suppose technically she could still be, but at the back of my head, I will always have to know that Banana Yoshimoto wrote the Premonition. And I just don't know how I feel about that. No, I do know. I hate it. I hate it with every fiber of my being. Like, it doesn't make me hate the other books that I have already read and loved, but it does just leave a sour taste in my mouth, you know? And that is why this book made #1 on this spot, because not only was it hugely disappointing, obviously I went into it with very high expectations, but it's just left a sour taste in my mouth for an author I was falling in love with. All of her books are a little bit weird, and I suppose when you're writing weird books, you're gonna have a few swings and misses, but to have such a big miss, and not just one, but two in one book, like, it's so bad I almost want to believe that it was intentional as some kind of sick, twisted joke to be like, yeah, I'm such a big author, I can get away with anything. But I think this was one of her earlier books, so I don't know. I don't understand it, and I don't know what to do with that information. But anyway, there we have it, my 10 worst books of 2023. Obviously, I will be making some favorites lists as well, but I wanted to give myself a little bit longer to read a few more books that I have high hopes for. And let's just keep our fingers crossed that I don't read anything in the next 2 weeks that really belongs on this list. But anyway, I would love to hear in the comments below what your least favorite book of the year is, or if you have a couple, I'm happy to hear it. This is a negativity and rant friendly space, obviously. But thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking shit. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of their support, and especially a big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie. And thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will talk to you soon. Until then, happy reading, and hopefully you don't read any bad books between now and the end of the year. That is my wish for you and for me, to be perfectly honest. I will talk to you in the comments below and in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye!